Hello, my name is Brett Phillip and I'm here on behalf of Grandland. We're here to talk about rental strategies in Victoria and the rental guarantee scheme at Arnold Box Hill and how it might work for you. Please note that this information is a general case only. There is no specific investment advice, but the information we are giving you may assist in what you're looking to do, as in purchasing a property. Let's talk about the Australian property market. It's had steady annual growth over a very long term. And if we take, for instance, a period from 1993 to 2018, the average annual growth for houses, for instance, was about 8.1% per annum. It was also 6.6% for units and apartments. And according to the National Australian Bureau of Statistics, housing, property, is the biggest source of national wealth and investment. It's a risk that's averse to short-term market changes, and that, in particularly in the current global context, comparing to shares and cash is extremely important. But it also offers ambient or flexible use. You can either lease a property, you can live in it, owner-occupied, or you can redevelop according to what type of property that it is. There are two returns on properties, two components if you like. You've either got capital return or capital growth, or the rental return. Houses, because of their nature, generally because they've got land attached to them and land is an appreciating asset, will continue to grow in value at a much higher rate, but they do have a less rental rate return. Units and apartments, however, whilst they have a slightly less capital growth, they do have a stronger rental return. The two components are obviously based on age and condition of the property in comparison to the return. So the two components comprise either a property which can expect higher capital growth or possibly better leasing returns, but in the current environment, capital growth is not a clear picture. Houses offer negative gearing, they can offset income for capital gains, etc. Units have stronger income return from rental, less maintenance costs, and of course lower land tax. Depending on your equity in your property, you could have cash in your hand each month. And especially with the low interest rates as they are at the moment, where income is a very important element. Types of leases, you've got your standard residential lease, and they average between 2.5 to 3.5% as a return. Student accommodation varies between 7 and 8% roughly. Then you have government-backed apartment leases, serviced apartments, which is like a hotel, 5 to 6% return on those generally, and then a customised or a guaranteed lease. Okay, let's look at some of the types of rental guarantees. The first one we're going to look at is the National Rental Affordability Scheme. Supported by the Victorian Social Housing Department under the Health and Human Services Department, it commenced on the 1st of July in 2008. Selected applicants have properties offered to the NRAS and they receive an annual incentive for 10 years. Generally, they are large-scale investment in affordable housing, investors to purchase from the approved participants in the scheme. The scheme stopped funding in 2014 and 2015, and the remaining properties are still receiving a subsidy under the scheme. This means that they are no longer new properties. The investors are locked in until 2026 in the agreement. They are generally, as we said, large-scale developments and usually in a lower socio-economic area. They're less attractive for investors who could also occupy, but not clear what's going to happen to the properties after the 10-year lease. Another option is the DHA properties, or the Defence Housing Australia properties. These are leased to military personnel. The leases are backed by the Department of Defence. They're then managed by Defence Housing Australia with lease terms between fixed times of 9 to 15 years. Look, the returns generally are higher than the local market average and they are backed by the DHA, but there's not many options in terms of the area of investment. The list of properties are provided by the Department of Housing Australia and the price of properties are fixed by them as well. You cannot break the lease for 9 years and they're usually located remotely or close to military areas in only a handful of locations in Victoria. Okay, let's now have a look at the National Disability Insurance Scheme, otherwise known as NDIS. In 2016, NDIS introduced funding for building accessible and affordable housing for Australians with disabilities. NDIS make payments to housing providers. The payments made by the NDIS come under the specialist disability accommodation payments and at a rate higher than the market rate normally. NDIS relies on these providers to create and maintain the housing for people with disabilities. The STA payments under NDIS is a standardised yearly amount based on location, size and level of accessibility. STA providers will receive a reasonable rent contribution, otherwise known as the RRC, from the tenant. A series of building codes and standards are to be met and they're certified by the NDIS and a building surveyor. The main focus is in the area of disabled access. The owner bears the additional costs of the build, and qualified NDIS housing is still a vacancy risk as the users are free to choose and negotiate the leases. Designed for people under 65 with very high disability support needs, they do have an asset life of about 20 to 30 years under the scheme. Now, for each of these types, we have got some links for you to click on. If you'd like to find out some further information, feel free to do so. You can find the information on those links in the tiles provided. Okay, so another form of investment strategy could be student accommodation or serviced apartments. Over my long time in real estate, I've done quite a number of sales in these areas, and there are a number of things that we need to look out for. So first of all, let's have a look at the type of structure that these properties are. Student accommodation, for instance, is a restricted title that is only and can only be used by students or teachers or those that are employed in an employment profession, and that is one thing that does restrict the use of the property. Generally, they come with smaller layouts. The cost of construction is at a lower level because they are designed for a specific purpose. Some have a vacancy period, some are leased on a fixed term, others generally offer, most of them offer actually higher rates of returns. The restricted title, as we discussed, does prohibit the use from people outside. So you cannot have a family member that's not a student living in the property, and that's something you need to be aware of. The other thing is when you're funding something like this, they're considered a commercial property in nature because of the restriction and the use. Therefore, your return in terms of borrowing could be reduced because of the higher rate of the loan percentage. The other thing is that you may need to also put in some personal cash because the amount that the banks might lend you is reduced as well. So the loan to value ratio comes down a little bit, and that's something you need to be aware of. The leasing is also controlled by a service provider, and their management rates are generally at a much higher rate than it might be for a normal residential provider in terms of managing the property. And the property, obviously for return, is tied into the value of the lease. Okay, the other option is serviced apartments. Now the return on these is rather good, and of course because of the type of nature they are, generally being a hotel type property, they do offer good quality maintenance in generally good quality buildings. But because of the nature of the lease and it's fixed over either 5 or 4 options, either between 3 or 5 years, you can't get owner occupation unless the operator decides to cease the operation or there's an agreement between both parties that they don't wish to offer that service any longer. It's pretty unusual. The returns at 5 to 6% are generally quite good, and the operator mostly manages the interior of the property and of course the common areas, and it's generally at a much higher rate than you'll find in a standard residential building. So there are some pluses to that. Okay, there are some things you need to look out for. Watch for the inconsistent leasing periods. A vacant possession and residential tenancies can occur with general leasing properties. Look for the nature of the property, whether it's a service property or a student accommodation, remembering that they have high returns but difficulty in getting into the access of the property for vacant possession. Or, in the case of a student accommodation, you have a restricted title where it is limited to either a student or someone working in the education system. Don't forget, these properties are regarded as a commercial lease and therefore a commercial agreement which means that you're looking at a commercial loan, not a residential loan, and your interest rate will be higher than a normal residential property. They can be a bit harder to finance because you may need to tip in some capital of your own, and therefore that may restrict what you can borrow, or it might reduce the amount that you're able to borrow. The commercial agreements also are rather long. Now, with student accommodation, a lot of them are year to year. In the bigger, more well-serviced developers, they can be generally filled within most cases, but I have known situations where the property can be vacant right up until March, April, or even May, and that time then the operator will start reducing the lease amounts to try and encourage someone to move in, so you can get inconsistency in your return. The leases for the serviced apartments, in most instances the operators will want at least 4 to 5 year terms, and they can either be fixed in 3 or 5 years. Because of the need for them to operate over the long term, it's unusual for them to want to break that system, therefore the access to the property for vacant possession is again restricted. In the case of residential properties, remembering too that residential tenancy laws are weighted in favour of tenants rather than landlords, and I won't touch any further on that, but that's where it sits. So what should you be looking for? Okay. Ideally, you want something that offers a long-term stable rent. That's number one. 2, you want something that's like a serviced apartment where you've got a stable tenant who takes care of the property, i.e. a commercial tenant like a serviced apartment. But you want that property to be residential in nature. You want a stable lease with a good percentage of return, but not too long and inflexible, and you want to know that the maintenance of the property will be taken care of either for insurance, buildings, interior, common areas, etc. So it looks and feels good at a constant position. It could make a huge difference when you look at what you purchase. Let's take, for instance, the current standard rate for investment property at the moment is about 2.6 to 3.1% per annum return. But if you assume a 50% loan to value ratio, if the rental is, say, fixed at 5%, that would give you an overall income on capital of about 6 to 7.4% gross per annum. If you include capital growth, which would maybe mean a moderate increase on the unit, you could be looking at something up to 10% per annum or more, all up. One of the benefits of the Arnold is the rental guarantee, and I call this the best of both worlds. What they've done and what they've captured in this strategy is a situation where you can have long-term investment of either 3 years, 9 years, or 20 years. It's leased to a management company with a strong portfolio. You have a 5% fixed return on all of the units at Arnold, with no vacancy period, no lease-free period, no advertising fees, no leasing fees, and you've got a management company that's responsible for the furniture, the blinds, the maintenance. So your quality of your property stays at a high level all the way through. It offers market reviews at the end of the 3-year lease period. The 5% minimum is always there as a backup. You have a commercial lease between you and the operator, and the owner, that's you, have the option to break the lease but with some costs and at a minimum time frame of 12 months. So you must own the property for a minimum of 12 months before you can break the lease. Now that's a critical point. That ability to gain vacant possession is the difference between all of the investment strategies that we've talked about. That then puts you back into a situation where you're able to then capitalise on market growth, either to live in it yourself or alternatively to lease it out through a normal management company like a rental agency or yourself, whichever you choose. Residential property and the residential apartment is a building that is totally encompassed in a residential block. Therefore, you're looking at a normal, high-end, well-built, total residential property. It has quality design, it has great finishes, it has great layouts, it also has, in some cases, excellent views, and the design, finishes, and all that sort of thing, again, are going to be maintained by the operator. It's an owner-occupied building, obviously, and there's also going to be some residential tenants, but it also offers low maintenance costs. The safety net for a rental guarantee at Arnold is its location. The lease is taken by a service provider as opposed to dealing with an individual tenant. Therefore, you're outside of the residential tenancy situation and you're not subject to a lot of the issues that can occur. Tenants not paying rent, they're vacating the property, they don't maintain the property. All of those issues that you would find with a normal residential tenancy, you won't have in this situation. The Arnold at Box Hill is in the Health and Education Employment Cluster around the Box Hill Hospital, which has recently been redeveloped, and there's specialist hospital units around that area, and Eastern Metro Activity Centre with a very strong rental demand. There's an option to either run with the operator or lease it outside of the guarantee by yourself. I think preferably at the 5% return, and given that you're going to have high maintenance and a high level of management, that would be the option I would prefer myself. One other thing to take note of, Box Hill experienced 928% capital growth in the last 20 years. This has come from realestate.com.au, a very, very strong source. The price of units have grown between 5 and 8% annually. So these are things to take into consideration when looking at buying a property.